that we have ultimately managed to have Probal in front of us, ready to deliver his talk today. Uh, this day, today, 23rd April, is also significant because, as we all know, this is Shakespeare's birthday. And Shakespeare's birth anniversary is something which is also very closely related to what Professor Roy will be talking about today, and that is postcoloniality. The reason is simple. Because you see, our tradition of doing Shakespeare goes back 200 plus years, and we had a very vigorous tradition not only of performing Shakespeare, but also of studying Shakespeare. And today I'm going to talk about just as prefatory material. Let me quickly tell you about a very famous play that was written back in 1893, a play called Siraj-ud-Dowla, which was written by one of the most important dramaturgs of that century and even of the 20th century, a man called Girish Chandra Ghosh. Now, those of you who have been fortunate enough to read the play or even to watch the play will find that there Siraj becomes a kind of an icon of anti-British resistance. And when Siraj talks about Bangla, what Siraj is really doing is to talk about nationalism. Now, this is something which I'll just briefly talk on for 2 or 3 minutes. You see, the whole notion of nationalism, as we know, is a Western concept. Because in India, before the British, there was hardly any notion like nationalism. But starting from the 19th century, we had seen that many Indians are talking about the concept of the nation of India, Bharatvarsha. And the point that I want to make is that this idea of nationhood, nationalism, is something that we had inherited from Shakespeare. You see, if you look at Shakespeare's plays, there you find the idea of nation. I'll just give you a couple of examples without making it any longer. Well, the first example is Henry V. You know, Henry V is a play in which the British king, Henry V, goes to France to fight a war against the Prince of France. He has got a very small army with him, and the French obviously are on home territory, and so they are fighting against the English. And on the eve of the battle, at the night, before the battle takes place, Henry V, the king, disguises himself and he goes out to talk to the ordinary soldiers who are cooking their food on small fires all around and near the battlefield. And as he talks to them, there's one soldier who questions him and says, "Whose war are we fighting? Aren't we fighting a king's war? And this king is a man, and tomorrow after the battle, there'll be so many hundreds of fathers who will be lost to their families. There will be so many sons who will be, killed forever. There will be so many children lacking a father. There will be so many wives lacking a husband. There are going to be so many women who are no longer going to have a husband." So you see, his point is, whose war are we fighting? It's the king's war that you're fighting. It's a very pertinent point. And Henry V is a very intelligent person, almost a Machiavellian figure. And so he turns around and says, no, no, no. You're not fighting the king's war. You're fighting for England. And in the days in the future, when you're back home, when you're playing with your grandchildren, you will tell them, "I fought in the Battle of England. I fought for England." Once again, England becomes a proposition, becomes a slogan of nationalism. The same kind of an iconization of a nation can be seen in another play of Shakespeare, that's Richard II. And you see, one of the most dramatic things about Richard II is, here is this man, this king, who's going to be about to be deposed. And he sits down on the ground, he reaches out and he feels the earth under his hands, and he talks about the sweets, the flowers of the country. And he says that as I give up my kingdom, I will also give up my land, my England. Now, why is this important? Well, you see, there was a performance of Richard II in Soviet Union ruled Poland back in the 1960s and the 70s. You see, at that time, there was something which was called the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was an occasion in which you see one Polish leader, a man called, sorry, I forget the name. Anyway, so there was this Polish leader who was, resisting the Soviet control of his country. And what happened was the Russians or the Soviet Union people, they sent tanks, military tanks, rolling into Warsaw, and they took over the country militarily. And you see, this performance was taking place in Poland a couple of years after the suppression of the spirit of unrest in Poland by Soviet Union. And the actor, this was a British actor. And the actor who was performing this, he was wondering whether the people of Poland would understand Shakespeare's English. He was wondering whether they would understand that the ground and the sweets on the ground, the flowers, these would be allusions that would be appreciated by the audience. And then he wrote a very famous account of what happened that night. He said, there was I on the stage. The stage was a narrow stage. It was a converted cinema hall. And there I was on the stage in my armor. And he says, I knelt down on the ground. I took off the glove of my right hand. I reached out to touch the dusty, dirty floor of the stage. And then I said my lines. And as I said my lines about England, about my own country, then I suddenly heard a strange noise. The strange noise, he said, is a noise that I've never heard before in my long career as an actor. The strange noise, he suddenly realized, was that the people in the audience were crying. They were literally crying because, you see, in Richard II, they had seen the Soviet Union take away their sense of nationhood. You see, this is Shakespeare, the notion of nationalism. And so you see, we in a sense are like Caliban. We, meaning we, the colonized people, the formerly colonized people, we are like Caliban. Why? Because you see, we have learned the English language from the pages of Shakespeare. And like Caliban, who learns language from Prospero, we have learned how to write back. We have learned how to curse the British. This is Shakespeare and colonialism, and this is something which I think may fit in with the discourse that Prabhal has today. But there's a final one, excuse me for 1 minute more, because there's a final touch that we'd like to tell you about. And that is the first Shakespeare Society in India was established in 1893 or 94, some say 95. So around that time, 1890s, let us say. And you see, one of the interesting facts is that the members of the Shakespeare Society at that time included Rabindranath Tagore himself, and more significantly, it included someone close to our minds, Sister Nivedita. The secretary of that Shakespeare Society had been a young man whose name was Shutish Chandra Chattopadhyay. Now, that was the first Shakespeare Society in the 19th century. In the 20th century, there was another Shakespeare Society in Bengal, which was called the Bongyo Shakespeare Porishad. That was headed by people like my own professor, Shakespeare professor, Professor Jagannath Chakraborty. It was moved ahead by people like Dr. Shitanshu Moitro, who was the head of the English of Rabindra Bharati University at that time. And that existed maybe for 4 or 5 years. Then in 1980s, specifically 1983, 1984, the new Shakespeare Society of Eastern India was formed. And I'm happy to say that this is an organization that is still going on today. And like in 1983-94, when I started out as the secretary of the Shakespeare Society of Eastern India, I still am the secretary of the Shakespeare Society of Eastern India. And once again, colonialism, us Indians, Shakespeare all come together. But enough said. I think it's now time that we invite Professor Probal Roy Chowdhury to speak. But before that, let me tell you something about Professor Roy Chowdhury. Dr. Probal Roy Chowdhury is currently Professor, Department of English, Sister Nivedita University, Kolkata. Earlier in his career as an academic, he has taught English and Cultural Studies at Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, which is a deemed university in Coimbatore. This was from 2006 to 2018. He served as a fellow with the Center for Policy Studies, Chennai, from 2018 to 2020. He was selected as a Rajiv Circle Scholar in History with a one-year fellowship grant awarded by the US-based Motwani Jadeja Family Foundation in January this year. Probal's doctoral thesis, which was titled Changing Profile of Community Participation in School Education in Madras Presidency 1820 to 1920, was a research work that extended upon the findings of the late Indian Gandhian thinker and historian Dharampal, 1922 to 2006, who, in his seminal work, The Beautiful Tree, published 1983, showed how prior to the British rule, there had been in the Madras Presidency a widespread and inclusive public education system in place, which is more advanced than the public educational systems to be found in Europe till up to the early 19th century. In his doctoral work, Dr. Roy Chowdhury presented, perhaps for the first time, substantial evidence to indicate that there was a major deprivation created within the educational domain of the so-called backward communities in India. This was consanguineous with the establishment and growth of English education under British rule. Professor Roy Chowdhury has also worked in the past with the Center for Policy Studies, Chennai, as a postdoctoral fellow, with the TVS Educational Society, Chennai, as an educational consultant, and also as a political consultant in one of India's leading think tanks. His teaching and research interests center around the history of education in modern India, society and polity in pre-British India, cultural and religious traditions of Bengal, post-colonial theory and literature, and Indian writing in English. In Kolkata, Probal Roy Chowdhury is a part of a small team involved in developing an India Studies Resource Center with a special focus on documenting the past and the present, socio-religious and cultural traditions of Bengal. At a very young age, in November 1996, Prabhal represented India as a delegate to the Young Voices in UN, which was held at the United Nations headquarters in New York, USA. In April 2018, Prabhal was part of the Indian delegation to the Third International Conference of Indologists, hosted by the St. Petersburg State University, St. Petersburg, Russia. Last month, Prabhal was also selected for the coveted Azad Fellow Award by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. Prabhal is presently working on a book documenting the history of Bengal's grandest festival, the Durga Puja, over the past 1 millennium. Prabhal has contributed scholarly chapters in books published by national and international publishers. His research papers have been published in indexed and peer-reviewed journals, and he also regularly publishes popular writing in both English and Bengali. That was Probal Roy Chowdhury's introduction for you. Now we know the scholar and we await his discourse. Prabhal, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, it was a formal introduction, and I think it was kind of necessary for the day. Uh, I am happy to see so many of our students here, and this is something that I'm going to talk about today. Uh, that is something that is very close to my heart, and I am not going to give a rather structured speech or discourse, or maybe a talk, but I just share with you what in the next 45 minutes or so, what some of my ideas and some of my intentions regarding the post-colonial discourse in India. I will, for want of time, I will keep it confined to India. And I'm very much tempted to begin with a rejoinder to Professor Dhar and to start with Poland. You know, the Second World War started with Germany invading Poland. When the Second World War was closing, the Soviets came through the Polish route and they defeated the Germans. And the Soviets claimed to have, given freedom to Poland, but it did not actually happen like that. The Soviets left a puppet communist government in Poland for the next few decades until the Polish people rose up in a revolution and they cleaned the country, literally cleaned the country, bulldozed the country of all Soviet era architecture, including their parliament building at that. So this was how Poland reacted, if you could call the Soviet occupation as Soviet Russian colonization or something like that. Now, after the British leaving us, Indians started uh, on their own on 15th August 1947. The Constitution was written and accepted, and we had our first general elections, and then we went on a program of planning, construction, development, and all that. And as part of that, the first city that independent India saw to be built was Chandigarh. Unfortunately, we did not act like the Polish people. We decided, our government of the day at that time decided to rope in French architects to construct or design the city of Chandigarh. Now, this speaks a volume of how the post-colonial society in India acted or reacted. Now, something that many people tell us today, that India is no more a post-colonial society, we are rather a post-colonial society. Though today, we have come to age in diplomacy, but still we are outside the sanctum sanctorum of the United Nations and many such things. Now, again, for want of time, I will not be addressing those debates, but I will center my discussions on something that I think will help us to think about what is so important regarding post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory, or the philosophy of post-colonialism in the Indian context. I'm also tempted to add another rejoinder to Professor Dhar. The concept of nation is perhaps different in India and in the West. One of the recent scholars who has written on this about restructuring India studies is Professor Balagangadhara. And he tells us that until and unless Indians stop looking themselves at the mirror held to them by the West, we will not be able to develop our worldview, which is very true. Because as long as we continue to engage with Western pedagogy, we will not be able to fashion or design our indigenous tools that would allow us to gauge, understand, redesign, redevelop, re-engage with ourselves. So the concept of nation, you see, there is a text in India available which is called Vishnu Puranam, if I am not wrong. It should have been written some 1600 years ago at least. It is in Sanskrit. And there is a shloka in Vishnu Puranam which describes the geography of India. Uttaram yat samudrasya himadraschaiva dakshinam varsham tad bharatam nama bharati yatra santati. So the land to the south of the great snow-capped mountains and to the north of the great seas is called Bharat Varsha, and the people inhabiting this are called Bharatiyas. It's a description that's there in our literature. The second is another profound example by somebody who is India's Shakespeare, many claim Kalidasa. So Kalidasa writes a beautiful epic poetry, Raghuvamsa. In Raghuvamsa, he talks about Raghu's Ashwamedha. In fact, critics claim that when Kalidasa is talking about Raghu's Ashwamedha, he is actually referring to Samudragupta's Ashwamedha, the great Gupta king Samudragupta's Ashwamedha, and there is reference to the whole of India. Our sacred literature, if we take Ramayana and Mahabharata as epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata also does talk of the Indian geography, not exhaustively, but certainly a great amount of geographical details is imbued in the text. Now, this brings me to the question of the Indian mind, which I propose to deal at length today. So when I talk of the Indian mind, or anybody talks of the Indian mind, we refer to the mind of the English or university educated Indians. And this reminds us of Ananda Kumaraswamy, who uses the expression educated Indians and then gives a footnote and writes, you know what? That is how victims of Indian education are described. Now, Ananda Kumaraswamy was not the only person who was saying this. In the early 20th century, in the late 19th century, similar things have been told by none other than Swami Vivekananda also. Even Sri Aurobindo would comment in the early 20th century that we are cut off from our roots by a mercenary education. Now, one of the effects of mainstream education is to marginalize inherited learning, which, though much restricted, is still very much alive. We all know through the letters of Macaulay to his sister in 1813 about the history of the purpose of English education, which was to produce people who might appear to be looking like Indians, but shall be English in spirit and habits of mind. And this is too well known a story. I'm sure our MA students will be able to appreciate this as they would have read this in their last semester. I guess Shantadeep is also here. But the mainstream education has certainly had one very clear effect, and that is it has uprooted us in the sense that there is complete disjunction with our tradition of thinking. It infuses us some kind of spirit of self-denigration. Hina bhavana. So we lack, apart from being ignorant, there is something like Indian thought that is presumed, there is a presumed opinion that, that is good for nothing. Okay, and it is superseded by new structures of knowledge, education. वो तो पुरानो दिनेर कथा बा something like वो तो पुराना हो गया. So this self-denigration produces a loss of self-respect. We lose our Attabhiman, Shabhiman, and all that. So I'm reminded of a speech by U.R. Ananthamurthy in Chennai when I was an MA student. And he told us, look, we have lost our swad. We have lost our taste. Okay, and he was seconded by Professor Harish Trivedi, of Delhi University, who went at length to describe how the colonial process and English education has deprived us of our indigenous swat, taste. And this has resulted in us becoming uncritical receivers and applicators of ideas. But, we must add a point here. It's not that we should not study other traditions. If we go back to 5th century and quote Bhartrihari, he says, "What does he know who knows only his tradition?" And that was a confident India at that time. Internally confident, intellectually rich, and with three very powerful sampradayas then, the Brahmanas, the Bauddhas, and the Jainas. And they were also interacting with the centers of learning that were in other areas of world at that time, namely China and Middle East. You'll also be wondering why a 69-year-old scholar, Fai Hien, would take a voyage with a land route, not a sea voyage, from China with 4 disciples, come all the way to India, stay in India for 6 years, go back to China, and then spend time in documenting what he has seen in China, in India. For the Chinese people, he will be documenting it, and he will write that Pataliputra is the greatest city on earth. So today we have to perhaps change the Bhartrihari's statement a little. What does he know who does not know even his own tradition? Now that is unfortunate. We have, by and large, broadly entered into a relationship of intellectual subordination. The Indian Academy is subordinate to the West. They are the theory and we are the data. They are the developers, we are the back office. So that is the unfortunate effect, and this is self-evident when we make comparisons with what Europe achieved through interaction with Indian studies in the 19th century and what we have done with Western studies today. Let me at this juncture share a personal experience. When I went to St. Petersburg State University in Russia in 2018, me and Professor Probal Roy were greeted by 2 young students who came and did namaste to us and said in chaste Bengali, "Amra St. Petersburg Jatiyo Bishwabidyalayar Bangla Bibhager Ditiyo Borsher Chhatri." Now imagine we have a Russian delegation and we have Indian students greeting delegates from Russia with the same impetus. This is exactly where we have failed, and this is a lacuna in our comprehension of the post-colonial world. I would now like to come to the point of what is this colonizing of mind? What does it mean? Well, we do not study our own thoughts and study only what we have received thought. We are uncritical receivers. But then, so what? What is the decolonization of mind that we'd like to talk about? And what is colonizing itself? Now, we must first understand what is colonization, because in the very word post-colonization, there is the word colonization, and post-colonization, as the word tells us, is something that has happened, historically speaking, after the period of colonization. Now, another thing that I would like to point out to you at the outset today, I am restricting my arguments to the British, English, or European colonization of India, and I am not speaking of the Middle Eastern colonization of India that happened prior to the British subjugation of India. Now, colonization is a context situation, and this context is of 2 kinds. One motivated by food and the other by profit. By food, I mean settlements, migrations, people in search of livelihood. We had a settlement history of India, and we have a settlement history of Indians going outside. Even today, there are large segments of Indian population in the United States, in Europe, and so on. This is one kind of contact. The other kind of contact begins with trade and commerce and end up with political and military subjugation. Generally speaking, we have a Valmiki followed by Rama. We can think of a third type of contact, which is of the Buddhist monks going all over Asia, or the Christian missionaries going all over the world. This is, however, there is, however, a difference. Incidentally, there is no history that Buddhist monks were followed by the Mauryan armies. There is in effect no such history, but Buddhist monks went all over Asia, and this brought about contact between Indian thought, Asian thought, and therefore Buddhism has become a thinking language of a large number of Asians, and the name of Ashoka, as H.G. Wells informs us, has become a byword in the Central Asian, Eurasian, and other parts of the world, if we use the phrase from Volga to Ganga. So this is the least problematic contact, where there is purely intellectual influence, and India has had the good fortune of being a donor of intellectual traditions for centuries. You all know the history of Takshashila, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Odantapura, and other places of higher learning in India like Ujjain and Kashi. I'm not going into those histories, but obviously there is much in history to say about the donor intellectual tradition that India, and that's how R.C. Mazumdar and others will tell you that India has been a Vishwaguru. Now, there is in such situations bound to be resistance to the subjugation of land and the subjugation of mind. But why is this resistance there? Obviously, because there is something about the identity, something about our own self-definition which gets altered or affected by such experience. Further, there is a natural or neutral response to retaining the balance, the equilibrium that is there in ourself, and it does not matter whether it is the individual self or the collective self, cultural self or the social self. So there is bound to be resistance, particularly from strong intellectual cultures with living codes, living system of ideas of those who have valued for long those living codes and systems. Because I look at culture as a set of codes, set of ideas. Civilization is a set of institutions which are founded on the bedrock of those codes. For example, you may have a code of grammar, a code of music, a code of society, a code of political system, and then you may have institutions that are founded on them. So there is resistance, and such cultures resist such subjugation. But this subjugation of the mind still needs to be looked into. Is it simply this that we start speaking another language, or we start using others' idea? But does that mean that our mind is subjugated? What is this mind? If you ask in our own context, you have to think about our own understanding of our knowing self, the cognizant self, and the layered knowledge. Now, before I go further, I would like to mention an American historian before you. I'm sure many of you would have heard his name, a famous man who, along with his wife, documented the history of world. His name is Will Durant. So Will Durant wrote an 11-volume history of the world, and the first volume was titled Our Oriental Heritage. And in the first volume titled The Oriental Heritage, he described the East, specifically India, as the cradle of human civilization. He argued that the birth of human civilization has happened only in India. So Will Durant, to collect materials for his seminal work, toured India a couple of times. And he was also a white man. He was appalled at the condition of India under British rule, and he wrote a book, The Case for India. This was sometime in the early 1920s. As soon as the book was published, it was proscribed, banned in India by the British rulers. They did not want the Indians to read the book and appreciate for it. So in this book, Will Durant has tried to vividly document how European colonization and prior to it, Islamic subjugation has bullied and sullied the soul of India. Very recently, I'll just try to give you an example in numbers, which is often quoted today even by politicians like Shashi Tharoor. So there has been a recent study which argued the amount of wealth that European colonizers or Britain looted from India amounts to an astounding 45 trillion US dollars in today's rate. 45 trillion US dollars in today's rate. I would also like to share with you some other data, something like this is also very well documented by Oxford and Cambridge scholars like Magnus Addison and Paul Byrock. You see, they have documented a millennial history of world economy. So there, if you look at, you will see in 1750, India controlled global trade. More than a quarter of globe's total trade was held by India. So it was the Battle of Plassey was yet to happen. English merchants were yet to become rulers in India, and they were to become the master of the largest and the most rich province in India, the Bengal province. So at that time, Britain's trade share in global trade was less than 2%, and India, without a central authority, was at about 27% nearly. So at that same time, India and China still controlled more than half of world's GDP and industrial production. All this without a central ruler in India, without India adhering to the notion of Western nationhood. These are interesting things to see or to reflect rather how Indians went about organizing themselves on their own when their polity was not hampered by foreign subjugation. So as we go into deciphering the colonial subjugation of India, I would like to mention a few other scholars who have thrown light into this. The first and foremost name that comes to my mind is the grand old man of India, Dadabhai Naoroji. He wrote a hard-hitting book documenting how the British rule created, or rather impoverished India and created poverty. Following Dadabhai Naoroji, we have a scholar from Bengal, a very erudite economic historian. His name is R.C. Dutt. In his 2-volume Economic History of India, he has documented the whole saga, how the British impoverished India. Very recently, another Bengali, Madhushree Banerjee, if I'm not wrong about the surname, she did her PhD in Oxford, and her thesis was based on how India supplied for Churchill's war. The context is the Second World War. When you had famines in India, Indian food grains were diverted to Europe and was being helped to feed the Allied forces fight and war in the European theater, a war which had no consequence or bearing on India's physical lands. And now this is a long continuing tradition. When the foreigners, the white Europeans, the British were gaining revenue control of India, were becoming masters of India. Large tracts of India were under forest cover. There was a discourse between, just before the war in Mahabharata, Dhritarashtra is not able to sleep. He is very afraid. He calls his brother Vidura. Vidura has just resigned as the prime minister. He calls him and asks for help. I am not able to sleep. So Vidura calls for sage Parasara, a very wise man. And sage Parasara gives a long discourse to the blind king Dhritarashtra to calm him down, and tells him in the discourse, he tells him that forests protect wild animals and wild animals protect the forest. So in 1890s, it is estimated that India had a tiger population of 1 lakh. Today, our tiger population is, I think, close nearly about 2000 or so. But in 1890s or so, 42% of India was under forest cover. And as railway tracks, as urbanization went on gaining momentum in the European theater, India lost its forest cover because timber, the trees were cut down and timber was transported to Europe. So they played out against God. Anyway, coming back to the question of the Indian mind, why this has happened and has repeatedly happened in India, when our own thought has appeared to recede, and we have an institution to handle such recession called Vyasaparampara. Vyasaparampara is simply a renewal institution. There are 30 Vyasas. And what we mean by Vedic Vyasa? It means the last 20th Vyasa, who was a contemporary of King Janamejaya. And by the way, King Janmejaya's Nag Yajna was performed at the Nigambodh Ghat in Delhi. So the Mahabharata texts, the Vedic texts, were all reconstituted there after the Great Disturbance. The Great Cataclysmic War, in which the scholars were driving chariots and got killed. Texts were lost and they were reconstituted. So this institution is a loss and recovery phenomenon, and this has gone on in India a number of times. So it is nothing new. It is something new after the 18th, 19th century British contact. Excuse me. We are in the process, in the midst, during the last 25, 30 years, of various modes of recovery in different ways. So this is something that ought not to be really very disturbing. It is a part of the dynamism of Indian culture. It has valued certain texts as texts of knowledge. You can say anything about them, it doesn't matter. You can express any opinion about the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, it doesn't matter. But then they are nonetheless texts of knowledge. They have been maintained with unique success. If you compare the history of the maintenance of Indian texts and say Shakespeare's plays, which were printed in his own lifetime, we note that 500 years later, a major industry is Shakespeare's authentic texts. But over thousands of years, Indian texts have come down intact. So we have maintained them. The community has maintained them. Why has it maintained them? It must be because of the great premium put on knowledge by the Indian mind. And Arjuna, who in Mahabharata is told by Krishna he must take to karma, he should take his bow and start, does not worry about knowledge systems as he is advised to choose the path of action. But we are told by Sri Krishna that nothing liberates like knowledge, that there is no greater purifier than knowledge. So ours is a knowledge-centered civilization. If you happen to hear the speeches by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, former president of India, in every speech he argues about India being a knowledge society. Now, this is evidenced by another fact. We know the history of the destruction of manuscripts in India, and still it is remarkable that there are more than 1 million manuscripts, if not more. Compare it to how many manuscripts elsewhere you may find. The fact that there exist 1 million manuscripts speaks of a very learned civilization. It is a proof that knowledge has been highly valued. So it has happened again and again, this loss and recovery. But what is it that happened in the British period? As I have already pointed out, culture is a set of codes, civilization is a set of institutions. To my mind, the British period was more remarkable for its civilizational changes. New institutions, civilizational institutions, judiciary, parliament, democracy, etc. They were both the instruments of subordination and also the instruments of liberation. There was a duality as far as the culture and texts are concerned because of what had happened by the 19th century. Okay, during Ashoka's period, there were 4 scripts, but the truth is, by the 19th century, we could not read any of them. So we had lost them, and it was James Prinsep who taught us how to read Ashoka's inscription. And you have the much maligned Lord Curzon. If he had not been there, we would not know about people like the king of Benares, who told his general that he wanted to build a new palace and therefore the main stupa in Sarnath had to be demolished for bricks in 1794. It was standing with the Dhamika stupa and was twice its size, and it was demolished. This is what was the state. I also recall that when the British resident told the ruler of Bhopal about the magnificent sculptures in Vidisha, he was told to take them away if he liked them, to which the resident had rejoined by saying, "You do not know what you are saying." That was the state, and therefore there has to be some sort of a recovery. Well, I forgot to mention about Lord Curzon. Had Lord Curzon had his way, then he would have shipped Taj Mahal to England. In the 19th century, a stark opposition is set up between the characteristically Indian all life is one view and the Western man-centered view. It was this intellectual opposition that was introduced at this stage in the Indian mind. I will share my speculations with you, and I know you will disagree with me. You must have already disagreed with me on a number of issues, but please bear with me for some more time with my freewheeling speculation. The Western civilizational intervention was not really a reinforcement of what Islam had first brought, both because Islam did not succeed in intervening intellectually in the matter as this 18th, 19th century Western influence did. I am referring to the man-centered worldview. The principle of man's centrality in the universe, that man is the center. Okay, you can refer to the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. God said, "I have made you in my image, and I have made all this world for you to enjoy," unquote. Well, if all these fruits and birds and plants and trees and fish and fowl are for you to enjoy, unquote. Man is the Lord and Master. He is the chosen creation. He comes at the end of the evolution as the best. Okay. So the concept of evolutionism incorporates in it the belief that all this is for man and man is central. Now, this was, is, and continues to be in very sharp opposition to the core driver in our minds that man is just a link in a chain of beings and not the privileged based, is certainly not the best one or one who has come at the end of a long claim, but he is just one of them. Being and non-being doesn't matter. So this grand idea has this concrete cross reflex: a shopkeeper refusing to kill a mouse and voluntarily giving him cheese, or a housewife getting up in the morning, feeding birds, dogs, cows, keeping some food for the incapacitated, then giving food to the elderly, then to the guests, then the children, then the husband, and then herself the last. So this is following the Upanishadic dictum, Annam Bahu Kurvita. This is Avratan. You have to ensure multiplicity of food, share it with all. This is the inviolable discipline of mankind, not of India, not of the Hindus, not of the Brahmanas, Buddhas, or Jainas, but this is the inviolable discipline of mankind. It is a whole way of life which stems from a core driver. Human beings are a part of the chain. Reality is not separate from human beings. You are a part of it. You are linked to it and somewhere linked to a superior entity. You can call him by whatever name you like, Allah, Brahman, the Almighty God. In effect, there is a superior entity who is there, and there are laws also which are powerful, universal, and general, to which you are subjected, and they are very fair laws. If the law operates adversely for you, you have only to yourself to blame, not the law. This is the broad view. I am putting it in very general, broad, common terms. This is in strong opposition to many sides of the Western meta-assumption. You see, man is central. Man is the base being that God has created. Everything is for man. It leads to a philosophy of self-indulgence to produce a consumer society, a philosophy of comfort, search for comfort, a philosophy of individualism, imperialism, everything, because you are the Lord and the Master. You have to pander to yourself, not cater only. For example, this will lead to a very different relationship with the environment. The belief that you are the best, you are the chosen, you come as a perfect, you come at the end of a series of evolutionary accidents, you come as a perfect realization. Descartes in On Method says, the goal of knowledge is to bend nature to man's purpose. And the Western civilization has been harnessing nature till it has brought about a virtual ecological disaster. So you bend nature, and you know what? Renaissance, the Renaissance in Europe was a turning point. Till then, God was an adversary. God was watching you. And in turn, God had to be watched when you were acting and living your life. This is the unending tension. Because if you do something wrong, he will punish you. And then, of course, he is merciful. You have to repent. You have to confess. You have to seek redemption. It may come. It may not come. So God was a great opponent, a powerful adversary. God made you a neuron. Then after Renaissance, God was replaced by nature. God was dead. They killed God. Then the opposition is to nature. Nature is very harsh, cold, permafrost. So nature becomes the adversary. This adversarial relationship has moved on, man against man and to man against woman. So they have progressed to various adversarial relationships. This whole philosophy of environment, which is controlled by this view. It is through this view, okay, through this need to control, the need to subjugate, that the idea of Western imperialism, the idea of European colonization or colonialism stems out. We might have freed ourselves from political subjugation. We might even have had an economic revolution, but have we freed ourselves from cultural subjugation? There is no running away from the fact that we need to engage with the world. Okay, we cannot live isolated. But the problem is, does India engage with the world as China does or as Russia does? I would not take the Russian example today because of the volatile situation between Russia and Ukraine. But unless and until we develop our worldview, the post-colonial society in India is not going to be a success. That is all, sir. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, sir. That was such an enlightening presentation. And I know it must be very, very difficult for you to wrap up such a huge line of argument in such a short span of time. And thank you nevertheless. I'm sure we are going to have quite a few questions. Yes. All right. While we wait for questions, sir, I had a question.
Yes, please.
All right. Sir, you were talking about the loss and recovery of language. So I wanted to ask you, for example, in the African context, you have Ngugi Thiong'o saying that I want to write in the vernacular. Whereas on the other hand, Achibi says that I prefer to write in English so that many more people can read it. Which point would you prefer? Would you prefer writing in the vernacular or would you prefer it in the English language? From the point of view of post-colonialism, of course.
Personally, I would prefer writing in the vernacular because it comes very easily to me. Now, from the political point of view, from the point of having a successful post-colonial studies, post-colonial theorization in India, I would appreciate, as a professor of English, as a scholar, or as a learner, I would very much appreciate that we write in both. We write in vernacular, we write in English. Writing in English, because there is no, I already mentioned, there is no running away from the fact that we live in a globalized world and English is the language to interact with the world. It's not 1920 anymore that, German is the high language of science, but today it is English. So it's very important that until we write in English, we are not able to interact with the world effectively.
All right, sir, but once again, aren't you giving the power to the self-proclaimed colonizer? I mean, English was the language of oppression.
I think Indians today engage with English more than the erstwhile oppressors do. And Professor Dhar will correct me if I am wrong. I think it was in Indian universities that teaching English was first initiated as a language in graduate and postgraduate programs. So I think we have our own history. And at this point, 75 years after independence, post-independence, with such, we are an economy bigger than most of the erstwhile colonizing nations. Our literary output is much bigger, though the West might be controlling the global institutions like the UN still and have not created space for 1/5 of the mankind. That's aside politics. I think we are growing and, just like they appropriated many things from us, I think we should appropriate their language and talk back to them in their language with our tools, in our pedagogy.
All right, sir. Well said. That answers my question. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions for sir? Yes. All right. Yes, we have a question. Just a moment, sir. Yes. So we have our MA student Shubhalakshmi Das asking the question. Is it the fault of the colonizers that we find delight in not knowing vernacular as much as English, or finding interest in our traditions, books, and songs? Or is it us, our joto mon toto pot, basically individualism, as Sir said, that English cultural colonization is an indispensable part of us? I think this is basically a roundabout manner of the previous question. But yes,
Yeah,
if you could
but
kindly answer this one.
I will congratulate Shubhalakshmi. Shubhalakshmi has twisted Jotomot Totopot to Jotomon Totopot. Good. Well, the fault is on both the sides. You see, after the British came in, we did carry on with our indigenous vernacular programs for a long time, until the British did something that the earlier rulers had not done, the earlier foreign rulers had not done. The British appropriated our revenue arrangement. And once the British appropriated our revenue arrangement, the local society lost its virility, and we could not support institutions at the local level. So this was the fault of the foreigners. And Mahatma Gandhi, in a 1921 speech at Chatham House in London during the Second Roundtable Conference, has beautifully described it. He called the Indian education system as a beautiful tree, and he said that the foreigners, the Britishers came and scratched the soil to look at the roots, but they left it just like that. And the beautiful tree of Indian education withered. We could not support it. Unfortunately, after independence, we have not taken pragmatic steps to reclaim our identity and culture. And this is not my words. These are words of Pavan Verma. Pavan Verma is a best-selling author. I have referred to him in my classes also. And he was formerly he's a politician now, but was India's former ambassador to Bhutan. He is an IFS officer, very erudite, very decorated. And this has been in his argument. If I have to say more, in recent years, the Tamil Nadu government needed a new secretariat and assembly building for itself. Tamil Nadu, as you know, is a land of great many temples, grand temples, classical architecture, Dravidian style and all that. So whom did the Tamil Nadu government employ to get the new secretariat and assembly design? They employed a German architecture firm with office in Frankfurt. So coming back to Anantamurthy's word, no taste for Indian things. So until and unless we stem this intellectual bankruptcy, we empower our own people. We should have empowered our own people when we built Chandigarh. Our Rashtrapati Bhavan, one of the finest and the most majestic structures to be the home for the head of state in any country, is purely an Indian construction. It is built by Indian architects. It might have been designed by the Luthians, but it's built by Indian architects. There is so much Indian to it. But when you look at Shastri Bhavan and other 1970 era building, when India was at the height of non-alignment movement, you will see they are all ugly Soviet structures. They have no resemblance to the idea of India, to ethnic Indian traditions. Okay, neither of the north nor of the south. You go to Chandigarh, you will see tons of unused concrete lying around, but they do not subscribe. It is perhaps good for French climatic condition, but it is not good for a city like Chandigarh and in the Indian context. That's what I have to say.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. Yes. Do we have other questions for sir? All right. Sir, Shubhalakshmi thanks you.
Okay.
Right. Yes, MB. I don't believe we have other questions.
Yes, I would like to invite Shubi sir for a quick comment on the lecture. Sir, are you there?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Prabhal, for this scintillating discourse on post-coloniality, a lecture which really goes back to the roots of our pre-colonized and pre-Islamic states of existence. My feeling about your lecture is that this is also a very romantic resurrection and a reconstitution of the past. But of course, while I agree with you on some very major counts, I do have a couple of niggling disagreements here and there, which is only normal. But if I may say so, I would defend your right to say what you have said with my life if necessary. This is the spirit of intellectual discourse, intellectual discussion, intellectual debate that maybe we need to do more in a country like India, and particularly in a very new university like Sister Nivedita University. Because let us not forget, Sister Nivedita herself is a kind of an exemplar of reverse colonization. Irish, Scottish lady coming to India, serving in India, and ultimately figuring as the figurehead of our university. I immensely enjoyed this talk on a personal level, and I would like to congratulate Probal in particular, and also Devdatta for a lovely handling of the whole session. And time has flown on. It's time, I think, that we ask our own Monikin Basu, head of the Department of English, to make the concluding remarks and the Thanksgiving. Monikin, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Prabhal sir, for that enlightening lecture. It was really very refreshing, and it seems like we are back into academia after a long time, since we have had the last week practicing for Salam Shakespeare. But nevertheless, yesterday we had a lecture by Sir Shubi sir. And in fact, today when Shubi sir set the mood for this lecture, and when Prabhal sir continued with it, it was quite enjoyable and extremely enlightening. Thank you so much, sir, for that lecture. Now the formal Thanksgiving. I would like to thank the Honorable Chancellor, Sri Shottam Rai Chowdhury, and of course, Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, Dr. Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay, and the Registrar of the University, Professor Shumon Chatterjee. Last but not the least, someone for whom Saturday with a Scholar has seen its 12th lecture, Professor Dr. Shubhi Dhar. Sir, thank you so much for your support, and thank you, Prabhal sir, for finally being able to do it, because last time when we planned sir's lecture, there was a catastrophe at home and he could not do the lecture. And at that point in time, Modhu Chandadi did the lecture for us. And I'm very glad that we have a team of students and faculty members who are always there by each other. So thank you all and wish you a very good night. See you all, and thank you, Devdatta, for that beautiful conduction of the session. Bye. Take care.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you,
much.
everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Let's end the meeting. Yes, MB? All right. All right, sir, with your permission. Take care, everybody. Have a very good evening. Great weekend.